When Ruth Bell pushed the ring back across the mercantile counter, every man in the room forgot his own business long enough to stare. She had buried one husband, buried most of her softness with him, and she would not take another out of pity with the smell of lamp oil, coffee beans, and wet wool hanging thick in the air. Eli Mercer did not take the ring back at once. He stood there in trail dust and late light, hat in his hand, his jaw set in that quiet way of his that usually meant trouble for somebody else. Ruth's fingers trembled once against the scarred pine counter, but her voice came out steady. No. Horace Vale, who kept the ledgers for Silas Grady and enjoyed other people's hunger more than any Christian man ought to enjoy anything, gave a little laugh through his nose. Somebody near the stove shifted his boots. Somebody else coughed and pretended not to listen. Ruth lifted her chin. I won't be bought kindly when I already refuse to be bought cruelly. Eli looked at her for a long second, not angry, not wounded, only clear. Then he said, soft enough that half the room leaned in to catch it. Ruth, if pity was all I had for you, I'd have kept my mouth shut and spared myself the answer. I asked because every place I've slept these last 3 years has felt empty, and your porch is the first one that ever felt like home. The tears hit her before she could stop them. Not loud tears, not weak ones, just a sharp, humiliating heat behind the eyes that came from hearing the one thing she had not let herself hope anybody still knew how to say. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight, and if you feel like it, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. It does a body good to know who is gathered round the fire with us. Ruth blinked hard and dragged the back of her wrist beneath her eyes like she was angry at them for betraying her. She did not answer Eli. She could not. Not with Horace Vale smiling that narrow smile, and not with Silas Grady himself leaning in the open doorway, one shoulder against the frame, his silver watch chain bright against his dark vest like the man had dressed for the pleasure of other people's ruin. Well, Grady said, voice smooth as creek stones. This is nearly worth the debt all by itself. Ruth turned toward him. She was a small woman only if a person looked at inches and not at the way she held herself. Grief had pared her down these past 3 years, but it had left the hard parts. If you've come for payment, say it plain. Horace flipped open the ledger with a little showman's flourish. Note came due yesterday, Mrs. Bell. Feed advance, seed advance, stove pipe, flour, lamp oil, 2 sacks of oats, and interest. He tapped the page with a clean fingernail. Mr. Grady is prepared to show mercy where the bank might not. There's always mercy in a wolf if the lamb agrees to lie still, Ruth said. A few heads dropped. A few mouths tightened to hide a smile. Grady pushed off the doorframe and came in, bringing the dry smell of horse sweat and sun-baked leather with him. All I ask is the south pasture and the spring parcel attached to it. 50 acres you aren't in a position to work anyhow. Sign it over, and the note disappears. The room went quiet again. Everybody in that valley knew Bell Spring was the one patch of water that held steady through August. Everybody knew Jacob Bell had fenced and cleared and sweated for it with his own hands before he died in the snow east of Crazy Woman Creek. Everybody knew Silas Grady had been trying to get his hands on it ever since. Ruth laid both palms on the counter. My husband planted cottonwoods there the year we married. And your husband is dead, Grady said, so lightly he might have been naming a date on the calendar. Sentiment is expensive. That was when Eli moved. Not fast. Fast was for boys and drunks. He just stepped between Ruth and the doorway, not looking at Grady yet, and said, You heard her. Grady's smile thinned. Did I ask the opinion of a hired hand with no herd to his name? No, Eli said. You heard mine anyhow. Now, Eli Mercer was the sort of man foolish people mistook for harmless. He did not raise his voice. He did not crowd a room. He stood loose and easy, one thumb hooked in his belt, like nothing in the world could hurry him. But there was a reason trail crews listened when he spoke, and it was not because he had ever begged to be obeyed. Grady saw it. So did Horace. So did Ruth, though she wished she did not. Take your kindness elsewhere, she said without looking at Eli. Both of you. It was the hardest thing she had said in years, and the hardest thing was that she meant it only halfway. Grady smiled again, having gathered himself. 3 days, Mrs. Bell. Come Monday morning, I either have my deed or the bank has your place. And if you think sentiment or proposals or town gossip will alter arithmetic, you have had too little supper and too much pride. He took the ledger from Horace, closed it, and handed it back. "Enjoy your evening." He left, and the room breathed again. Noise returned in little embarrassed scraps. A spoon against a cup. A boot scrape. Somebody buying sugar they did not need. Eli set the ring down on the counter between himself and Ruth, as if he no longer trusted his own hand with it. "I meant what I said," he told her. Ruth kept her eyes on the worn groove in the wood where years of elbows had polished it pale. "That don't make it fair." "Fair to who?" "To a man who ought to know better than to offer his life to a woman already half buried in another one." His face changed then, just a little. A shadow crossed it. And for the first time that day she remembered he was not speaking from some untouched corner of the world. Eli had buried a wife too, long before Jacob died. Fever took her on the Platte and left him with a silence he carried like a spare coat. He put the ring back in his pocket. "I know exactly what I'm offering." She gathered the flour and coffee she could no longer afford, but had begged 2 more days to pay for. Then offer it somewhere else. He might have argued. A different man would have. Eli only lifted the sack from her arms before she could stop him and carried it out to her wagon. Ruth followed because there was nothing else to do. The evening had turned sharp by then. Cold crept down from the hills, bringing the smell of sage and dust. Her mare shifted in the traces, stamping once on the packed dirt. At the wagon, Eli set the supplies inside and rested his hand on the sideboard. "You're not driving home alone tonight. I have for 3 years. Tonight's different." She looked past him toward the ridge west of town, where the sun was slipping low and red over the shoulder of the bighorns. Because a man embarrassed himself over a ring? Because Grady doesn't like witnesses when he's decided something belongs to him? That made her meet his eyes. He was right, and they both knew it. Ruth climbed to the seat without thanking him because gratitude had a way of turning into surrender if she let it. Eli swung onto his own horse and rode beside the wagon as they left town. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. Wheels rattled over stones. Leather creaked. From somewhere down in the draw came the thin silver sound of water moving over rock. The Bell place sat where the valley narrowed, and the grass gave up pretending to be generous. House, barn, chicken run, 2 cottonwoods by the porch, and farther off the dark line of the spring pasture Ruth had refused to sell. It was not much to look at if a person valued acres the way men like Grady did. If a person valued memory, labor, and the stubborn grace of a thing kept alive by hand, it was nearly a kingdom. Ruth climbed down, took the flour, and turned toward the porch. "Good night, Eli." He did not move. "I'll stay till your lamp's lit." "I don't need a guard." "Then call me a guest." She almost smiled at that, which annoyed her. "You ain't much of one." "Best kind. Leaves before breakfast." She had just set the sack inside when the horses screamed. Not whinnied. Not startled. Screamed. Ruth ran back out with the flour dust still on her hands. The barn was already burning at one corner, flame chewing up the dry boards with a hungry sound that seemed alive. Heat hit her face. Smoke rolled low and black beneath the eaves. Inside, the gelding threw himself against the stall gate hard enough to shake the whole structure. "Bucket line," Eli shouted, already moving. There was no line to make. No neighbors near enough. Just the well, the trough, and 2 people running against a fire that had been planned by somebody who knew exactly where dry hay had been stacked. Ruth did not waste time cursing. She grabbed the axe from beside the woodpile and ran for the barn door while Eli kicked through the side stall and got the gray mare loose. Sparks burst upward in the wind. A beam cracked overhead like a rifle shot. The air tasted of ash and old straw and fear. "Ruth." She ignored him and swung the axe once, twice, 3 times into the warped pin on the gelding's gate until the wood gave way. The horse came at her wild-eyed, foam at his mouth, and she stepped straight into him, one hand on his cheek, one hand hard on the halter. "Easy now. Easy, boy. Easy." It was the same voice she used on frightened calves, on colts tangled in fence wire, on Jacob in the months before he died when a hard winter had emptied him out from the inside and pride would not let him say it. Low and certain. No room for panic. The gelding shuddered under her palm. Then, because Ruth had asked it of him as if obedience were still possible in a burning world, he went still enough for her to lead him out. By the time they stumbled clear, the roof on the far side had caught. Eli dragged the saddle rack free just before the wall blew inward in a shower of sparks. Ruth snatched the old metal brand from the dirt where it had fallen, then stared. It bore AG, twisted in iron. Grady's hired men used that brand on the spare stock they pastured north of town. Eli saw it in her hand and went cold all through his face. You keep that. Ruth looked at the barn as the roof gave way for good, flame painting the windows of the house and the wet shine in the horse's eyes. The last of Jacob's hay, winter feed, tools, harness, half her chance of surviving the cold months ahead. Something changed in her then. Not broke. Broke had happened before. This was something cleaner and harder than breaking. She closed her fist around the hot iron until it burned her palm. All right, she said. Eli turned to her. All right, what? Her throat worked once. All right. You can help me. That was the point after which nothing in Ruth Bell's life was ever allowed to return to what it had been. By dawn the barn was a black skeleton and the whole valley knew. News traveled quicker than mercy in cattle country. By noon 2 women had come by with biscuits wrapped in cloth and 1 old man had brought a rake he claimed he was not using anyhow. By supper, 3 men who owed Grady money had ridden past slow enough to show they were curious. Then faster once they saw Eli at the fence line with a shovel across his shoulder. Support in a frightened town came in ounces, not pounds. Ruth spent the morning sifting what could be saved. Her palm was blistered where the iron had burned her. Her dress smelled so thickly of smoke she could taste it each time she swallowed. Eli worked without talking unless the work required it, which was one of the things she hated and relied on in equal measure. Near noon she found him in the ruins turning over the metal box Jacob had kept under the harness bench. The hinges were warped, but the papers inside had survived, singed only at the edges. Tax receipts, seed orders, a folded county survey with Jacob's penciled notes in the margin. Ruth knelt beside him in the ash. Let me see that. He passed her the survey. Jacob's handwriting was there all right, cramped and sharp. Beside the line marking Bell Spring, he had written, original stake moved. Pike knows. Ruth read it twice. Who's Pike? Eli asked. Amos Pike. Surveyor. Half-blind old man with tobacco teeth. Came through when Jacob was filing the final boundary years ago. She looked up slowly. Jacob told me once Grady tried to shift the south line 10 yards in the night. I thought he was angry and talking wild. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was right. They took the papers inside. Ruth spread them over the table where she'd once rolled pie crust on Sundays before the world narrowed to chores and debt. Her finger moved over numbers, dates, amounts. She had always kept the ranch books. Jacob could read a sky better than any man alive, but figures wandered in his head. Ruth never forgot one she had written herself. Horace added interest twice here, she said after a while. And this feed amount is too high by $4.60. I remember because I argued him down on the oats in March. Eli leaned over the table, hat off, hair damp with sweat at the temples. You can prove it. I can prove what I paid and what I signed. If the clerk's copy of the note don't match his, then Grady has more than arson to worry about. He looked at her with something very like admiration, and that was nearly worse than pity had been. Ruth busied herself stacking papers. Don't look at me like that. Like what? Like I just turned into somebody you didn't expect. His mouth tilted, barely. Ruth, the trouble with this valley is not that nobody knows what you're worth. It's that too many people do, and they were hoping you'd forget it first. That sat between them for a moment, warm and painful at once. It was the first of those small truths that reach a person deeper than speeches ever do. By evening they had a plan. Ride to the county clerk in Buffalo first thing. Compare the filed survey and the note. Then find Amos Pike if the survey looked altered. The harder part was not the miles. It was that Ruth could end the matter, in one sense, by taking Grady's offer. Sign over the spring. Keep the house a little longer. Survive quietly. But Bell Spring watered more than her own pasture. In dry months, the runoff fed 2 downstream kitchen gardens and the public trough by the church. If Grady fenced at all, 3 more families would choke slow behind her. That night, as the lamp burned low and the wind pushed smoke smell back through the cracks of the house, Eli slept in a chair by the door with his hat tipped over his eyes and the rifle across his knees. Ruth lay awake in the bed she had once shared with Jacob, listening to the creak and the old boards settle, and understood the choice plain. Safety, for one season, bought with surrender. Or standing up now, while she still had enough left of herself to do it, and risking what remained. By morning she had chosen. The ride to Buffalo took 3 hours if a horse was willing and a wagon was not involved. They went horseback, Ruth in her husband's old split skirt and coat, Eli riding a little behind unless the trail narrowed. Frost still hid in the shadowed grass where the sun had not touched. Once, near the creek crossing, Ruth's mare shied at a blown tumbleweed, and Eli reached out without thinking, steadying the bridle with 2 fingers and letting go again before the gesture could turn tender. The county clerk, Mr. Henshaw, wore sleeve garters and spectacles smudged with whatever passed for lunch in his office. He disliked disturbance, and disturbance disliked him right back. Ruth laid the note copy on his desk. "I want the filed original." Henshaw adjusted his spectacles. "This is irregular. So is charging the same widow twice for the same sack of feed." He flinched as if widow had weight to it. "Mrs. Bell, these matters are better handled through the bank." "The bank set my barn on fire, did it?" That shook him enough to fetch the file. The note did not match. The signatures did. The principal amount mostly did. But the interest line had been altered, and the due date on Horace's copy had been pulled forward by nearly a month. Henshaw went pale under his whiskers. Ruth did not feel triumph so much as cold certainty. "The survey," she said next. He brought that too, slower than before. On the filed map, the south line clipped the outer edge of Bell Spring exactly as Grady had long claimed. On Jacob's singed paper at home, the line sat well below it. Eli leaned in. "Can a field map be changed after filing?" Henshaw wet his lips. "Not lawfully. Can it be done?" The clerk looked at the door, at the window, anywhere but at Ruth. Amos Pike kept the original field book. Surveyors usually do. If there is a discrepancy, his measurements would settle it. "Where is he?" "Up past Hazel Draw last I heard. Took to living in an old line shack when his lungs went bad." When they came back out into the street, the wind had shifted warm and carried the smell of horse apples, coal smoke, and frying beef from the hotel kitchen. It should have felt like an ordinary afternoon. It did not. Eli checked the cinch on Ruth's saddle. If Pike confirms it, Grady falls hard. If Pike's still alive. If Grady hasn't reached him first. That, more than anything, got them moving. Town noticed them. It noticed everything. Mrs. Dillard from the boarding house stood in her doorway, twisting her apron, and gave Ruth a quick nod that said more than a public speech would have. Sheriff Tom Barlow came out of the jail rubbing his jaw, saw who they were, and stopped dead in the sunlight. "You two heading somewhere unwise?" he asked. Ruth answered before Eli could. "Depends whether the law plans to come with us or stay here polishing its badge." Barlow's eyes flicked to the rifle on Eli's saddle, then back to Ruth. He was not a cruel man, which sometimes made his kind of weakness harder to forgive. "Silas Grady is a powerful citizen. So was Pharaoh," Ruth said and rode on. By the time they reached Hazel Draw, the sun was dropping and the trail had narrowed to stone and pine roots. The air smelled of resin and cold dirt. Somewhere above them a hawk cried out, sharp enough to make the silence after it seemed deeper. Eli slid from the saddle near a fork in the trail and crouched, touching the ground with 2 fingers. "3 riders," he said. "Passed maybe an hour ago. Heavy horses. One shod with a cracked left rear." Ruth looked down and saw nothing but dust and hoof marks. Eli read ground the way other men read letters. It was his one undeniable gift, and he wore it lightly, which made it seem almost holy. Grady's men. Could be. They're in a hurry. They pressed on. "And before we ride into what happened up there, let me ask you something plain. If you had been where Ruth stood then, with one honest man beside you and a whole valley trained to look away, would you have trusted him at last, or would grief have told you to keep one hand on the door latch a little longer? I know what I would like to believe. I also know loneliness teaches hard lessons." The line shack sat in a bowl of scrub pine and broken granite, smoke barely lifting from its pipe. Ruth felt hope before she let herself name it. Then she saw the second horse tied behind the cabin, and every hopeful thing in her body went tight. Eli raised one hand. "Listen." From inside came voices. One old and ragged. One smooth. "Silas Grady." They slid from the saddles and came in low along the back wall. The window was cracked at the corner, enough to hear. "Don't owe the dead man anything," Grady was saying. Amos Pike coughed, a wet tearing sound. "I owe the truth. The truth is a luxury for men with strong lungs. The truth," Pike wheezed, "is where the stake stood before your boy moved it." Ruth's breath caught. Grady went on, patient as a preacher. The widow signs, or she doesn't. Makes little difference to me. But if that book finds its way to Buffalo, people may start asking foolish questions about the Bell note, and then I would have to take a harder tone with this valley than I prefer. There was a scrape of chair legs. Eli looked at Ruth once. He did not have to say what they were both thinking. Jacob had not died by bad weather and bad luck alone. He had stood in the path of a man who could not bear to hear no. Eli counted with 2 fingers. 1, 2. On 3 they moved. Eli hit the door hard enough to break the latch. Ruth came through behind him with Jacob's old revolver already in her hand. Inside, the line shack exploded into noise. Pike in bed under army blankets. A hired man at the table reaching for a gun. Grady rising too fast, knocking a cup to the floor. Coffee and glass everywhere. Don't, Ruth said, and the hired man froze because there was something in her voice bigger than the revolver. Eli kicked the other gun under the stove and hauled Grady back from the bed by his coat collar. Not rough. Exact. Pike struggled upright, his face gray and beaded with sweat. Field book, he rasped. Under the mattress. Ruth snatched it free, leather cracked with age, pages thick with figures and compass marks. She had it. She truly had it. Then the second hired man came through the back wall window in a shower of glass. The room went to pieces. Eli turned. Grady drove an elbow into his ribs. Ruth fired once and missed, splintering the door frame. Pike shouted something no one heard. The hired man slammed into the table, sending the lamp spinning. Flame whooshed up the curtain. Smoke hit the room in a black fist. Right, Eli shouted. Ruth did the one thing every part of her wanted not to do. She ran with the book. Outside, the air hit cold and clean. She heard boots, coughing, a curse from Grady, then Eli behind her. They hit their saddles half blind with smoke. The trail down from Hazel Draw was no place for speed, which made speed the only thing left to choose. Shots cracked through the trees. One branch burst apart above Ruth's shoulder. Her mare lunged downhill. Pine scent and churned dirt, and the iron taste of fear filled her mouth. Eli was just behind, then beside, then gone from sight when the trail bent through a cut of rock. Eli, no answer. Just hoofbeats, shouts, another shot. She hauled the mare up long enough to see him farther back on the upper track, turned broadside across the trail with his rifle leveled, making himself a wall between her and the men coming down. 1 against 3. Go, he bellowed. It was the last clear thing she heard before the horses thundered and the canyon swallowed all other sound. She rode because there was a field book in her coat and a dead husband in her memory and a living man behind her spending himself to buy a few more minutes. She hated him for forcing the choice. She loved him for the same reason. By the time she reached the creek flats below, her face was wet, and she did not know when the tears had started. Dusk came down fast in the valley. Ruth hid the mare in willows by Bell Spring and doubled back on foot with the revolver and a lantern she did not light. The cold was rising. Frogs had begun in the reeds. Her boots filled with creek mud, and the hem of her skirt dragged heavy with it. She found him by the old sheep shelter above the water, sitting against the rough boards with one hand pressed hard to his side. Blood had darkened his shirt, but not poured, which meant the bullet had gone through flesh and missed the center of him God kept. For one full second Ruth could not breathe. Then she crossed the last ground to him and dropped to her knees. You stubborn fool. His mouth moved. I've been called sweeter. She touched the wound, and he hissed. Warm blood slicked her fingers. Her whole body started shaking then, not from fear exactly, but from the release of having found him alive when she had already pictured the other thing. Can you stand? With help. She got his arm around her shoulders and half dragged, half walked him into the shelter. It smelled of old lanolin, damp wood, and mouse droppings. Not much of a refuge, but it had a roof and a door that still shut. Ruth built a small fire from the dry wood stacked in one corner and boiled water in a blackened pot somebody had left years ago. Eli sat on a blanket, pale under the smoke grime. When she cut away the shirt, he looked off toward the dark rather than at her hands. The bullet had furrowed through his side under the ribs. Painful. Bloody. Not fatal if kept clean. Ruth washed it while he held still for her out of manners or stubbornness. Maybe both. After a while he said, Pike? Alive when I left him. Grady won't dare kill him now if he thinks the book's already in town. You got it. She reached inside her coat and put the field book in his lap. His eyes closed once in relief. They sat with that for a bit, the fire snapping low, creek water talking somewhere outside, the cold pressing against the boards. It was the first stillness either of them had been granted since the mercantile. I heard him, Ruth said quietly. At the cabin. About Jacob. Eli looked up. He had the line moved. And I think he had more to do with Jacob's death than weather. Jacob told me somebody cut the bell mare loose the week before he rode east. Said he thought it was boys. She swallowed. Jacob never believed in evil until it was already at the gate. Eli stared into the fire. There's something else you ought to know. She waited. The year Jacob filed that survey, Grady sent me with an envelope for Pike's assistant in Sheridan. Said it was payment owed. I never asked for what. His jaw tightened. A month later, Jacob and Grady quit speaking. I put the pieces together too late. Ruth did not answer at first. The shelter held the smell of smoke and hot metal and blood. Somewhere in the reeds, a night bird called once and stopped. You want me to hate you for carrying a thing you didn't understand? She said at last. I'd understand it if you did. She wrapped the clean strip tighter around his ribs and tied it off. Eli, I have had enough men deciding for me what my heart ought to do. He gave a short breath that almost became a laugh, and then winced because laughing hurt. There she is. She sat back on her heels. Firelight caught the lines at the corners of his eyes, the fatigue in him, the gentleness he was always trying to hide because the world was mean to gentle men unless they knew how to fight too. I didn't refuse you because I didn't feel anything, she said. That landed hard enough to change the whole room. She kept going because stopping then would have been cowardice dressed as caution. I refused because I did. Because I could hear how true it was. And true things cost more than I had left. He watched her without moving. Ruth looked down at her burned palm, now wrapped in a rag gone gray with ash. After Jacob died, folks brought pies and verses and advice. Then they went home to their own tables and left me with the sound of my own spoon in the bowl. I got used to being the woman people admired from a distance, same as they'd admire a tree that lightning split and somehow didn't fall. No one asks a tree if it's lonely. Eli's voice came rough. I would have. She shook her head once, tears threatening again. That's just it. He was quiet long enough that the silence itself became tender. Then he said the line she would remember the rest of her life. A person can live along while on scraps, Ruth. But not if they start believing scraps are all they're worth. That did it. She bent her head and cried the way people cry only in front of somebody who has earned the sight of it. Not pretty. Not loud. Honest. Eli did not try to hush her. He only sat there, wounded and stubborn and present, until she had breathed through the worst of it. When she could speak again, she took something from around her neck. Jacob's old brass compass, small and dented, kept on a thin leather cord because she had not yet known how to stop wearing it. He carried this the day we married, she said. Then every day after. She laid it in Eli's hand. I don't give it to replace him. No one could. His fingers closed around the compass as if it might break. What are you giving it for, then? For the road ahead, she whispered. He bowed his head once over her hand and kissed the burned palm, so gently it felt less like desire than a vow. If this part is catching you in the chest tonight, then you are exactly who this story was meant for. Leave us a like, subscribe if you haven't, and then come right back to the fire, because tenderness is not the end of a story like this. Sometimes it's the thing that gives people the strength to finish it. They did not sleep much. At first light, Ruth saddled both horses while Eli tried, and failed to pretend he was fit to ride without help. Pain had tightened him, but the steadiness in him remained. We go to Buffalo, he said. We go to town, Ruth answered, cinching the saddle herself. But you're not doing the talking. By the time they reached the square in front of the courthouse, word had spread. Grady had called for a public settlement at noon, meaning to force Ruth's surrender where every eye in the valley could witness it. He liked ownership best when it came with applause. People stood in knots beneath the awnings. The church ladies, teamsters, boys with sunburned noses, men who owed Grady money and men who hoped never to. Horace Vale waited near the courthouse steps with a portfolio under one arm, trying to look like the kind of man history forgets to punish. Silas Grady stood at the center of it all. He smiled when he saw Ruth dismount. Then he saw Eli climb down, pale but upright, and the smile shifted. Only slightly. Enough. Mrs. Bell, Grady said. Have you come to your senses? Ruth handed her reins to a boy without taking her eyes off him. I came to collect what you owe. A murmur ran through the crowd. Horace stepped forward. This is not the place for dramatics. Funny, Ruth said. You seemed fond of them in the mercantile. She took the courthouse steps one at a time and turned so everybody in the square could hear her. The noon sun was hot on the back of her neck. Dust lifted in little devils at the street edge. Her mouth was dry enough that her tongue felt thick, but her voice held. This man altered my debt note. He altered my survey. He burned my barn. And years ago he stole the spring my husband fenced with his own hands. Grady laughed, rich and easy. You accuse like a woman with nothing left to lose. Ruth met his gaze. No, I speak like a woman who finally remembered what she has. She held up the field book. Horace moved first, foolishly. That proves nothing. Then why did your employer ride to Hazel Draw yesterday to take it from a dying surveyor? More murmurs. Sheriff Barlow, who had been lurking in the shade in the hope the day might pass without needing courage, straightened against the hitch rail. Ruth opened the book. Amos Pike's original measurements place Bell Spring 14 yards north of the filed line. Here, and here, and here. Same bearings repeated 3 times because he did not trust men who smiled too easily. She lifted her chin toward Henshaw, who had come out onto the landing and now looked ill. And Mr. Henshaw can tell you the filed copy differs. Henshaw swallowed. It does. Horace turned on him. Mind yourself. No, Ruth said louder. You mind yourself. Because I'm not done. She drew Jacob's singed account book from her satchel and laid it atop the field book. These are my husband's figures. These are mine. Every payment entered. Every sack of oats. Every length of stovepipe. Your note added interest twice and shortened the due date. That is theft dressed in penmanship. There it was then, the thing Grady could not abide. Not resistance, but exposure. His face did not redden. It sharpened. You expect these people to take the word of a widow over mine. Ruth looked out over the crowd. I expect them to take the word of records. And if that still feels too thin for you, perhaps ask him why my barn burned with one of his own brands in the ash. Eli stepped forward and set the twisted iron on the courthouse step with a clang that rang through the square. Grady's eyes flicked to it. Small mistake. Visible one. Barlow saw it too. Still, Grady might have wriggled loose. Men like that always had. But Ruth had spent 3 years learning that silence protects the wrong people unless somebody is willing to break it at cost. So she played the last card not with fear, but with precision. You killed Jacob for that spring, she said. The whole square seemed to inhale at once. Grady's smile vanished. Careful. Jacob told me somebody cut his mare loose before he rode east. Amos Pike heard you threaten him. And yesterday, in that cabin, you said if this book reached town folks would ask questions about the Bell note. Men don't fear questions unless the answers are guilty. Horace started toward the steps. Eli blocked him with one look. Grady's voice dropped low, dangerous now. Your husband died because he thought a poor man could stand in the path of progress and not be crushed. There it was. Not a full confession, perhaps, but pride nearly always finished what guilt tried to hide. Ruth stepped down one stair, closer. No. He died because you were too small a man to bear being refused. Something ugly moved across Grady's face then, something stripped of polish. He reached for her arm. Ruth was ready. She caught his wrist, turned with the motion the way Jacob had taught her years ago when breaking colts and dealing with men who mistook size for weakness, and used his own forward force to pull him off balance down the courthouse steps. He hit the dirt on one knee hard enough to grunt. Before he could rise, she had the revolver at his chest. Gasps broke out all through the crowd. I buried one good man already, she said, steady as winter. I will not bury this valley with him. That was the moment. Not when Eli proposed. Not when the barn burned. Not even when she wept in the sheep shelter. This was the moment the whole town saw Ruth Bell plain for the first time. Not poor widow, not sad relic, not a piece of land with hands attached to it, but a person in full possession of herself. Sheriff Barlow came forward then, finally dragged by his own conscience into usefulness. He drew the cuffs from his belt. Silas Grady, he said, voice shaking only a little. On suspicion of fraud, arson, and the murder of Jacob Bell, you are under arrest pending territorial review. Horace bolted. He made 3 strides before Mrs. Dillard stuck out a stout boarding-house foot and sent him sprawling face first in the dirt to the loudest cheer Buffalo had produced in years. The rest came fast after that, as justice sometimes does once it finally gets moving. Amos Pike was brought down from Hazel Draw alive enough to swear his affidavit before the preacher and the doctor. Henshaw surrendered the altered files. Two of Grady's own writers, finding loyalty less profitable once the shackles came out, admitted to setting the Bell Barn fire on his order. Bank examiners came in from Sheridan and found enough crooked paper in Horace Vale's accounts to paper the inside of a jail cell twice over. Grady lost everything the way men like him most dread losing it. Publicly, piece by piece, under the eyes of those they once believed too small to matter. His herds were sold. His house was seized. The spring parcel remained with Ruth, and the water rights below it were written in proper hand for every family he had meant to starve into dependence. The valley did what valleys do after a storm. It pretended, for a little while, that it had always known where right lived. Men tipped hats to Ruth in town who had once looked past her. Women stopped by the house without needing an excuse. Sheriff Barlow, perhaps ashamed into decency at last, saw that Jacob Bell's death was recorded as what it had been: murder, not misadventure. As for Eli, he healed slower than he liked and faster than Ruth feared. He spent 2 weeks in her spare room because sitting a saddle opened the wound, and because she said so, which turned out to be a force stronger than argument. Sometimes he chopped wood with his shirt open and the bandage showing. Sometimes she found herself watching the line of his shoulders through the kitchen window and had to remind her own foolish heart that she was no girl. On the third Sunday after Grady was taken away, Eli stood on the porch at dusk with the repaired compass hanging now from his watch chain. The cottonwoods whispered above them. Supper dishes cooled in the sink. Somewhere down by the creek a calf bawled for its dam and was answered. He drew the ring from his pocket again. Ruth looked at it, then at him. "You don't give up easy." "No. You planning to make a habit of public embarrassment." "Was thinking private hope this time." She laughed then, a sound rusty from lack of use, and so beautiful it made him go still. "What if I say no again?" she asked. "You won't." The confidence of it ought to have annoyed her. It mostly warmed her. Ruth stepped closer. "You know the trouble with a woman who's had to save herself for this long? Tell me." "She gets particular. I've noticed. She won't marry a man because he feels sorry for her. She won't marry a man because she's frightened. She won't marry a man because the valley finally learned her name." Her eyes held his. "She'll marry a man because when the whole world caught fire, he was still the safest place in it." Eli shut his eyes once, brief and grateful, as if receiving a blessing he had not dared ask for aloud. Then, "Ruth Bell," he said when he opened them, "will you marry me?" "Yes." It came out simple, not grand. Grand was for people who had not learned how precious plain things were. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that were usually steadier. She touched the edge of his jaw, rough with evening beard, and kissed him there first, then on the mouth. Warmth traveled through both of them slow and sure, like creek water finding a way under ice. They married before winter in the little church with the warped floorboards and the bell that always rang half a second late. Mrs. Dillard cried openly. Sheriff Barlow looked embarrassed by his own emotion. Amos Pike, stubborn enough to outlive spite, sat in the back pew wrapped in blankets and coughed approval into a handkerchief. Ruth wore a dark blue dress because white had never suited her idea of honesty. Eli looked at her like a man seeing home after a long trail. Months later, when snow lay clean on the fence rails and smoke rose from the chimney in a blue straight line, people would still tell the story of how Silas Grady fell and Ruth Bell stood. But the story Ruth cared about most was the quieter one that followed. How the spring kept running. How the south pasture greened again. How laughter returned to a house that had forgotten the sound of it. Some doors don't open when you're young enough to run through them. They open when you've learned to knock gentle, wait honest, and recognize home when it finally answers. One April evening, years later, their porch lamp burned gold above the creek while apple blossoms drifted through the yard, and Ruth and Eli sat side by side in the rocking chairs, her hand resting in his as the last light settled soft over Bell Spring. And if you'll join me next time, I'll tell you about the deaf seamstress her own family sent west in disgrace, and the one-armed rancher who was the first man alive to understand that silence can carry more love than words ever could.